Where did it all come from? How did it start for you?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting because there's some parallels with my story and the stories that you just heard, starting with a story that came out in 2017 from a report that found that Mississippi was approving less than 2% of people who are applying for cash welfare assistance. So this program I'm talking about, it's the Federal Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. It's a block grant that started in the 90s during welfare reform, and it gives block grants a set amount of money to states every year for them to spend on cash assistance to poor families, usually known as the welfare check, or just innovative programs designed to interrupt generational poverty. But the guidelines are so lax that states can really do whatever they want with the money as long as they can kind of just say that any number of these programs fit into some vague goal of either promoting two-parent families or preventing out-of-wedlock pregnancy. And so back in 2017, when I found out that we were approving so few families for cash welfare in the poorest state in the country, where we certainly have, thousands of families living in poverty, I wanted to know where the rest of the money was going, because we still get that money every year. And I, had started doing research on the program and found that, only around 5 to 10% of the money that we got every year was actually being spent on cash assistance for poor families. But the state's programming and the goals and the ways that they were spending the money outside of cash assistance were very kind of nebulous and not well defined and very hard to see in action. And so at that time in 2017, I started filing public records requests with the Department of Human Services, the state agency that administers these funds. This is an agency that it doesn't have a board, so it doesn't have a really good oversight function, but it's a department strictly under the governor's office, and the director of that agency takes its direction from the governor. So started sending public records requests in 2017. They sent me, they were really good at giving me like exactly what I was not looking for. They do have to submit federal reports showing how the money is spent, but these are very vague reports that just kind of give general categories with dollar amounts, no receipts or expenditure reports or anything of any detail to show how they were spending the money, and more importantly, how what they were spending the money on was actually doing anything to solve poverty, right? How did our poverty rate change as a result of these programs? There was no evidence of any of this. So starting in 2017, filing public records requests. In 2018, I was getting so frustrated because they had strung me along and sent me these things that didn't make any sense. They would never answer any phone calls. And so I went to Mississippi Today in about mid-2018, and I told them that I wanted them to hire me on. I was at the Clarion Ledger before this, when I started this story. And I went to Mississippi Today and I asked them if they would hire me specifically to cover poverty so that I could really dig into the issue of poverty as a whole, but also, specifically these public assistance programs. What is going on with them? Why are they being so secretive? And I had filed a complaint at that time against the agency, and I kind of brought that complaint over with me to Mississippi Today, and they were very supportive of me, just kind of like let me loose on this topic. And I dug in. I remember like one of the first emails I sent my editor when I got there was like, I am investigating the state's TANF program. And I'm sure he was kind of like, okay, that's fine. And we didn't know, what kind of fraud was occurring. We didn't know how big of a story it was going to be. But we just kept pulling that thread and putting pressure on the agency. And there was one employee at the agency in particular that I was talking to at the time who would sometimes, return my calls and just kind of like try to temper me a little bit. And that employee, I didn't know at the time, but he was gathering some evidence of suspected fraud against his superior to take to the governor, who then turned that information over to the auditor. It's kind of funny because the auditor is credited with starting the investigation into the actual fraud here. And he was one of the first people that I called when I got the job at Mississippi Today and said, I think DHS would be a good subject for an audit. It turns out it was a really good subject for an audit. So he started his investigation in 2019. at the same time, I'm still pulling records, reporting stories about specifically these two nonprofits that were getting tens of millions of dollars from this welfare program with, very little like evidence of what they were doing. There were a lot of glossy like brochures and sort of promotional campaigns about how we were stabilizing the family, but there wasn't a lot of evidence of what was actually occurring. And then the arrests came in 2020, and in which one of those nonprofit founders and the director were charged with actual embezzlement, and that sort of broke, the story wide open and led me down, all the paths that I've gone down in the past 3 years, to really finding out who received all the money and who was all responsible for this tragedy.